I'm going to introduce and lay out the text, the context in which we're presenting. Christian will come on and talk about Montreal, and I will come back and then talk about another example. We're, in a sense, very much complementing and building on what Jennifer and Todd opened up for us. And Jennifer opens up the whole question of labour in the context of the smart city, of the shifts and transformations that may be taking place. And we asked the question, or Jennifer asked the question, we would agree and support it. Where is labour in this process and what are the implications? So she traces out that in a rather challenging and disturbing way. Todd, in a sense, does exactly the same within the industrial context in talking about worker power and technological change. We would take these two introductions, these two presentations, as laying the context for what we want to say, because what we want to look at is what are the possibilities and vulnerabilities with unions themselves in trying to address at a regional level questions relating to the industrial sector, as Todd outlined very clearly and very comprehensively and eloquently, and in the area which we're going to call, which we need to reflect on, the political arena, what's happening in terms of the types of activities that Jennifer is talking about in terms of the shifts that are taking place in socio-economic relations, in regions, in cities, in places, here, there, and everywhere. This work builds on our recently published book about unions and regions and regional governance. And we're trying to lay out a case to say, well, what's happening in terms of the contexts and the different spaces in which regions operate and work in. So what we're looking at is unions and confederations in regions. And we're looking at the experimentations that may take place. It's not a paired comparison in terms of the unions. It's a contextual comparison, we're looking at the contextual relations and contextual contexts in which unions can operate. And we're looking at the possibilities and limitations there. We're looking at Canada, the aero industry in Canada, in Montreal. We're looking at Australia. We're looking at a very specific region, a region known as Gippsland, and we're looking at the ways in which the unions in that area tried to open up space to address broader non-industrial issues. In the aero industry, Christian's looking at the ways in which the unions opened up questions about the industrial relations, the work and work circumstances within the sector, within the region. So what we're doing and what we're asking is a set of questions. What the challenge in front of us intellectually, scholastically, is to ask how, under what circumstances can unions open up new spaces and engagement? This is the question that's implicit in Jennifer's work and implicit in Todd's work. And we then have to say, well, who's involved? What are the limitations? What are the possibilities? Now, as I said earlier, we're looking at a contextualized comparison rather than a paired comparison. We're locating each of the examples historically, and we're drawing on a lot of qualitative and related data collected over long periods of time to try and look at what unions are doing, what are the constraints on unions, what are the possibilities on unions. So it's an exploratory study. It comes out of the 10, 15 years of debate between Christian and myself about what's happening. Where is union power? How can unions act? What are the limitations on unions? What are the possibilities? In that sense, complementing and putting the other side of the story to Todd and Jennifer. Christian, tell me when to move to the next one.
Yeah. So we're going to present it Montreal and then Tasmania, not Tasmania, Gippsland, and we're using the CRIM template. Then the CRIM template is that we're trying to look at different time period and try to making different type of sequences and looking at how the experimentation is taking place in T1, T2, T3. So we're using the same type of framework to see how problems are changing, how the context is changing, the regional governance is changing, and how power relations are also changing. What we are trying to do in the introduction of the book, we're using not a new, but because we're familiar with the four pieces that you presented. And when we started to write, we said, we have to try to find a new way of looking at, I don't know if it's good, you will tell me when you will read it, Todd. We distinguished two dimensions, structural power and dispositional power. And structural power can be economic, as you were saying with Silver and Wright, but we also think it's political. And we added the political dimension because we were reading the work of Culpeper. And we were talking with Glenn Morgan, and he was saying, what are you talking about structural? This is not structural. So there was like a debate about how economic geograph conceptual power, structural power, and political economists. So we tried to integrate that into the way we address these issues. And the other one was dispositional power. And this is related more to how they can reinforce their capacity through institutions and through organization. So this is where we're going with this. And here we focus more on one dimension of power, dispositional power, its capabilities, okay? Union capabilities. And we want to show how when the problems are changing, the type of experimenting they are doing, they have to have new capabilities to deal with these issues. So the first question we're asking, what is the role of union in the process of experimentation? When we distinguish between organizational and institutional experimentation. Then we look at what type of strategic capabilities they are using and whether this becomes, whether when they are transforming their capabilities, it's transforming the union. The purpose of the union and how they define themselves. You can go to the next one, Peter. So this is not, you cannot read that. That's Peter, once again, we were not very good with our slide, but it's not the first time that it happens. So
what does it look like?
Hey?
What does it look like?
It's very difficult to read with the it's absolutely impossible to read it. But oh, okay, no, it's not too bad. It's me. So we're looking at the type of challenge they are dealing with, the regional governance intermediaries that exist, the union response, and then the strategic capabilities. And I don't want to go through all of this, but when we look at T1, and just a time to give you a time frame, we look at it from the 1980s to 2019. So this is in 1980s, and it was really the issue of short of skill, and at that time the union had to put pressure in order to create an intermediaries that still exists today to deal with the issue of skills. But the union at that time, they were really using traditional mode of action, and they were really operating only at a local level. So this was a step moving from the local to the regional, which changed the union capabilities. They have to frame around skills, and also there was scaling up, going at the regional level. At the T2, the main issue was about coordinating between different type of organization and collective action. You had a densification, and you were talking about that in your earlier comment, Jennifer, when you were saying that in Quebec, there's densification, and really in the aerospace, there was a very important densification, and the union participated in the creation of these institutions, but perhaps more importantly, the union also had to develop their own organization. So they modified their organization that were local, and they also built a regional union organization to able to deal with these issues. And this changed how the union the capability of the union. They had to look, and this comes back to what Peter was saying, they had to develop a vision. Their narrative, their framing was a vision of the industry. They had to look at how they can take into account the interests of various actors, including management, including government, including education systems. So they had to integrate a plurality of interests in the second time. Then we move, Peter, to the third time. And there, the union is trying to have a more grasp on the supply chains and the SMEs capabilities. So it's not just about collective bargaining. Their interest is being enlarged. So they are engaging in new area, value chain, technological innovation. They're building new transnational alliance. Political mobilization, I put in parentheses, it was more a type of pressure that they were doing on government. But there again, what it meant for them, they had to build a new narrative, a new frame that was built around industrial policy. They had to articulate employment issue with industrial policy, and they had to navigate across scales. So it was not only the local, it was not, before it was the regional, now it was also the international. So what we're trying to show through this, and I must say that where a lot of people work, Sarah's working on with me and Julie, it's a team that's working on this. We see that there's like a real link between the problem the union is facing, how they respond, and the type of strategic capabilities they have to develop. This is what we're seeing here. So the last one, Peter, what our main takeaway here? For union to get involved in regional governments, they must develop their own strategic capabilities. If they don't do that, they won't be able to play an important role. And this is related to framing, articulating, mediating, and learning. To be able to move from organizational to institutional experimentation, they have to change their way of acting and their way of thinking. And there, I think Julie's thesis was really much on that, but it was on Denmark. And we were looking at this, and this is really something that makes a difference when you're looking at organizational experimentation versus institutional experimentation. And we put a focus on that. And what this involves is union has to have a reflexive process. To look at their own practice, to look at the practice of other actors, and to try to change the way they are operating. And this is never an ending project. It's always ongoing. We don't know if they're going to go backward or upward. And what is interesting is that when Peter is looking at the political aspect, there are differences and similarity, but we see that the strategic capabilities, I think, is important. So now, Peter, I let it back to you to go to Gippsland and to conclude.
Thank you very much. Now, just very briefly, Gippsland is a region to the east of Melbourne. It goes from the east of Melbourne in Victoria, which is one of the provinces, to the border in New South Wales. It's a self-contained area. There are mountains in the north, there's sea at the south, there's nothing in the east, and there's this little gateway into Melbourne. It's an agricultural area. It's an area where energy and mining has taken place. It's the heartland of electricity generation by carbon fuels in Victoria, now under extreme pressure and will change. In that area, there is a confederation. There's a number of unions in the area, and there's a confederation. And we're going to talk about that. And we're going to talk about, in a sense, the ways in which they got locked into very innovative organizational experiments at the socio-economic development transition level for the region, but they couldn't institutionalize, they couldn't scale it into the ways in which the unions organized and operated. So we're talking about those strategic capabilities of union confederations to open up issues, not just for the industrial sphere, but for the political sphere, and the constraints and limitations on that. And whoops, sorry, my thing is very delicate. Anyhow, I hope you can now see this. What we're doing is looking at a time period of 25 years. The background is that the Gippsland Trades and Labour Confederation, the confederation for all the unions in the region, was for 20, 30, 40 years essentially based until the 2000s on what was called the State Electricity Commission, a government-owned commission that mined and generated electricity. And that area in the middle of the region became the defining metric for the Confederation. With privatisation of the State Electricity Commission in the late 1980s, early 90s, the Confederation more or less collapsed. And it was then rebuilt, and it was rebuilt in the 2000s. And that's the story we're now telling. It was rebuilt by a small team led by a very innovative and charismatic construction union leader. And they recreated the Confederation with a very explicit view of going beyond energy and mining, because they grasped and recognized and developed the narrative to say that they were a union confederation that represented the unions in the region in a variety of ways, often uneven, often ad hoc, but nevertheless, they looked at things like union education, looked at lobbying and advocacy, particularly over health and safety, and they began the process of reaching out further. So they framed their capabilities, they articulated it, and they developed an inclusive metric. In that process, and I guess this might be a bit, I hope you can see it. In this process, they built up a distinctive governance approach. So they participated in regional fora. They encouraged a reaching out by union leaders further than just their own specific industrial interests. They developed a narrative which took the form not of the ways in which we scholastically define it, but they practically defined themselves as a community union organization, a community union confederation, reaching out into the terrain of the region. In other words, a union narrative that went beyond industrial concerns. And in that, they laid the ground for that from 2000s into about 2009, 2010, 2011. And at that point, a lot of uncertainty becomes apparent. Uncertainty in the context, because it becomes the moment when the federal and state governments begin to look at the coal and energy area and begin to talk about closure of the coal fields, particularly 2011, 2012, under a federal Labor government. And that opens up debates and concerns clearly within the Confederation about what happens to our members. Where will they go if there is closure? What is the future for them? And the leadership was very eloquent in both saying we recognize the importance of the climate crisis, we recognize the necessity of change, but what we want is a planned closure for the mining and energy sector, not forgetting the other areas of activity, but we want a planned, closed, inclusive, and just transition, although they did, at that point they didn't use that type of language. It's in this context that the common vision begins to fracture. And you, of course, understandably get the energy-based and mining-based unions specifically concerned with that sort of activity and what's happening to them, and the Confederation then beginning to debate and discuss and deliberate on what this all means. In 2016-17, the first major closure of a generator took place. And it's at this point, 2 years earlier, the charismatic former leader had died. There'd been a change of leadership, which was committed to continuing the past narrative. But as time went by, the concerns of those unions on the Confederation that were based within the mining and generation sector began to take prominence. And they began to argue a very specific set of changes. And in that context, the new leadership works with the state government in developing practices. An employment and workers transition project was established, which was to facilitate the movement of workers out of the industry into other areas. They also began on a project basis, which was quite different from the previous period. There'd been a lot of talk about project work and a lot of talk about how we could develop various things. And some of that was, and I now have to reveal that I was part of that discussion, but we failed to get the funding and we failed to get the support. The new leadership was able to get that support within a very specific context. So it was vulnerable and it was uncertain. And it's in that context that we saw a change of repertoires.
Peter, 2 minutes, please.
A change of repertoires of action. The framing was recast and so on. So what we have in this is a way of looking at unions in terms of focusing on their capacities, focusing on the ways in which they develop in uncertain and conflictual and difficult circumstances, narratives. So the union purpose is refamed rather than redefined. And these frameworks constitute a union experiment, but it's uncertain, it's vulnerable, it has to be institutionalized in order for it to succeed and be maintained. So that's what we're presenting to you. We're presenting a thesis which says experimentation involves organized and institutional initiatives. It comprises a continuum between industrial and political concerns, but these activities in the industrial sphere and in the political sphere are tentative and can be made vulnerable. And as Christian said, we are looking at forms of union power which need ongoing reconstruction, an ongoing process of concern and activity. Thank you.